Hi, folks. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about something I did yesterday. Yes, I was on Jubilee's Middle Ground. It was the Americans versus Europeans version. Very interesting debate. Very good conversation to have. Now, for anybody who doesn't know how Middle Ground works, they usually take an issue or two opposing perspectives and they put four people on each side. So 8 people total, 4 people on one side of the issue and 4 people on the other. This time, it was Americans versus Europeans. So 4 Europeans versus 4 Americans. And I was on the American side, of course. Now, what was interesting right out the gate was that out of the 4 Americans, I was really the only clear conservative. The other guy, Fernando, very nice, very cool guy. We were aligned on a lot of things, but not everything. I'd say he falls somewhere in the middle, which is normal. I'm involved in politics, so I'm very clear about where I stand. But most Americans fall somewhere down the middle, and that's not an indictment on Fernando or anybody. That's just the reality of how things go. People vote on issues. They're not necessarily just aligned with one side of everything. Now, what stood out even more to me, though, was the other 2 Americans, the 2 women who were there. They were very much on the left, and I'd say on some issues, hard left. And for most of the conversation, they were essentially taking the European side. So the dynamic quickly became less Americans versus Europeans and more like 6 against 2. And honestly, in some moments, it felt like 7 against 1, where I was stepping in and basically defending America most of the time. And it was actually good to be that counterweight because I felt like I was bringing things back to reality a bit, especially because there were a lot of narratives being thrown around that just weren't grounded in facts. At one point, I even said, I have to stand up for America here because there was just a lot of this information being floated around, a lot of mainstream media narratives being repeated without any real evidence behind them. Now, another thing that stood out to me was the casting on the European side. It was strange, to say the least. Out of the 4 Europeans, it seemed like they only chose about 2 of them who were actually of European descent in the most traditional sense. The other 2 were African Europeans. One of them hadn't even lived in Europe most of her life and just had an English accent. And the other was African French, I assume. And look, that's fine in terms of citizenship. But if you're talking about representing Europe as a civilization culturally and historically, that's a different conversation. It would have been more interesting to have heritage Europeans on that panel, meaning people from native European populations, white Europeans, historically Christian Europeans. That's what Europe is built on. That's what the majority of the world thinks when they think of Europe. Obviously, there are demographic changes happening right now. There is a great replacement playing out in Europe. And as a result, the left is pushing a competing idea of what Europe should be. But I think we can all agree that when the majority of the world thinks of a French person, they're picturing someone ethnically European, that being white Christian. That doesn't mean others can't be citizens of those countries or of the European Union, but heritage and citizenship are not the same thing. Now, all that being said, the discussion itself was very interesting because, like I said, the dynamic was basically stacked. I ended up defending America most of the time, and there were just so many false narratives being thrown around. For example, there were claims that ICE is out killing immigrants in the streets, and not a single person could cite an example of that claim. They were conflating completely unrelated incidents like political agitators dying and trying to frame that as ICE targeting American citizens, which is just not a reality. It's just clear misinformation. There was also a lot of outside gazing where people were romanticizing Europe or presenting it as an ideal society. And as someone who has family in Europe, who grew up in Brazil, and who has lived most of my life in America, I can tell you that perspective just doesn't match reality. I love this country. I love America more than anything in the world. It is the greatest nation on earth, and I wouldn't choose to live anywhere else. And the irony is that many of the Europeans on that panel are here in America for a reason. And some of them even admitted that because this country offers opportunities that don't exist elsewhere at the same scale. Now, what was also interesting to see was the level of cope, how people will pay lip service to this idealized version of Europe instead of acknowledging what it actually is. Europe is not this over-romanticized utopia. It has serious issues. In many places, people are living in what would be described as a near subsistence conditions compared to the American standard of living. There's inequality, there's economic stagnation in certain regions, and limited upward mobility. And yet people talk about it like it's the pinnacle of fairness and freedom. And that's just not representative of the truth. And look, America has its own problems, obviously, but America by far supersedes what Europe has been able to achieve in the modern era in terms of opportunity, in terms of innovation, economic strength. So to sit there and glorify European systems that America explicitly fought a war to free itself from, just doesn't make any sense to me. If you truly believe Europe is better, then just go live there. Seriously, go experience it. And by the way, good luck immigrating there, because it's not nearly as easy as it is to come to the United States, despite all the criticism that so many folks love to throw at our system. Now, stepping away from the politics for a second, I actually loved the entire experience. The difference between Middle Ground and something like Surrounded is huge. Surrounded feels like a confrontation, a planned confrontation. It feels theatrical, like you have to jump in and go at people and win moments. Middle Ground felt more like a real conversation. The people there were intelligent, they were thoughtful, respectful, even when we disagreed. They weren't necessarily trained debaters, and that's fine because that's not the point of that format. It's meant to be a natural conversation where people express their views without it turning into a performance. And I really enjoy that environment because it strips away the need to win and instead allows you to engage in real conversations with real people. And honestly, I think that's something that's missing from our current discourse. So much of what we see online now is performative. Debate has become the most popular content vertical. It's about clips and moments and dunking on people. And over time, that reduces the value of the conversation itself and just flattens everything. And that's what I love about this format, because it brought things back to something real, tangible. It was one of the fastest conversations I've been a part of. It honestly flew by, and it left me wanting to keep on going. Just keep talking. I love to talk. And afterwards, we all took a group picture together. Everyone was so kind. The crew was great. The cast was great. It was genuinely a very positive experience. But there was one moment that really stood out to me. One moment that I think was very telling and ties into a much bigger conversation happening culturally and politically right now in the country. It's something I'm very passionate about, and I think it deserves a deeper breakdown. So I want to share this clip with you guys. This was during a discussion on gun control. The prompt was that strict gun laws make Europe safer than America, and obviously I disagreed with that, so I stayed back at first, listened to everyone talk for a few minutes, let them hash out their arguments, and I stepped in. And I'm going to start with my statement because I summarized what they were saying and pointed out some things that led to some statements that were very revealing.
All right. Well, I thoroughly disagree for several reasons. You mentioned that the Second Amendment is foundational to this country. Beyond its foundation, I think it just gets so misinterpreted. There's just so much negativity, and it's been so polarized. It is actually incredibly hard to get a gun in California, for example. If you're 18 years old, you can't. It'll take you maybe 2 weeks. It'll cost you thousands of dollars. You kind of mentioned getting rid of the weapons doesn't necessarily get rid of the violence. All that happens, you see it in the UK, you got rid of the weapons, people are just getting stabbed. They're just having mass stabbings. What are you going to do? Get rid of the knives now? Or are we going to have to walk around with Nerf knives to cut our steaks? What are we going to do, you know? I also want to clarify one thing. The statistic about children being killed by guns got brought up a lot. So the amount of deaths every year is about 40,000 gun-related deaths every year. 4,450 are children. Now, obviously, that number is awful. But if you're going to undo a foundational amendment in the country to serve 4,450 tragic deaths, you're stripping 330 million people of their rights. I would go as far to say that the #1 killer of children is actually abortion. You get 1.3 million children. A third of Gen Z has been wiped out. I don't think it's funny.
I mean, I don't think that's what we're talking about.
I mean, but I'm just saying, if we're talking about children being killed, outlaw abortion.
Well, okay, wait. To that point specifically, I'm assuming you're Christian or
Yes,
have some kind
Catholic.
I also am Christian. So I think the issue with that specific argument is abortion is killing like a fetus or a baby. To the points that have been made about violence against children is that's a different stage of life. We're talking about children and not babies.
Now, folks, I just want to be clear. That was an insane admission. Maybe one of the most insane things I've ever heard someone say in a debate. Now, for context, before I stepped out, there was this whole conversation about why guns should be outlawed, centered around the claim that they're the #1 killer of children. So naturally, I stepped in, corrected the record, and presented the data. Roughly 40,000 gun-related deaths per year in the United States, and about 4,450 of those are children. And of course, Every one of those deaths is tragic. No child should die. That should go without saying. But then I presented the other side of the perspective. If we're going to strip 330 million Americans of a constitutional right because 4,450 children are killed by guns tragically every year, then why wouldn't we also apply that same standard to abortion, which results in about 1.3 million child deaths every year? And immediately people got upset. Oh, that's different. That's a different issue, blah, blah, blah. No, it's not. It's not different in the way you're framing it. You're advocating to take away a foundational right from the entire country based on one set of deaths while completely refusing to acknowledge a far larger number of deaths happening every single year under abortion. And this is where it got really revealing. One of the women tries to make a distinction and say, wait, we're not talking about killing babies. We're talking about killing children. Just think about that, folks. She specifically draws a line and says, we're not talking about killing babies. We're talking about killing people, children in a different stage of life. Excuse me? Wouldn't you say a baby is even more defenseless, even more vulnerable? That distinction is incredibly telling. It exposes a deeper moral framework where the category itself is being manipulated to justify one form of killing while condemning another. And that's what I mean when I say this whole interaction is revealing. You're essentially hearing an argument that says killing babies is acceptable under the framework of choice, but once they're outside of the womb, now it becomes unacceptable because we want to take your gun rights away. That's the justification to strip a foundational right of the United States of America. And that contradiction is staggering. It's not consistent at all. It's logically incoherent, and it shows how selective these moral arguments can be. By the way, here's something that I like to bring up in debates, which I didn't get a chance to bring up here. You've probably seen me do this before on debates that I posted on this channel. One of the ways to really break this argument open is to bring up the scientific consensus around where life begins. Because one of the common arguments you'll hear from the left trying to defend abortion is some form of, well, when does life actually even start? And then it turns into a philosophical discussion about personhood, value, and everything else that follows that line. But here's the thing. Many of the same people making that argument will often appeal to the scientific consensus in other areas. For example, they'll point to something like climate change and say there's a 95% scientific consensus. Therefore, we should follow the science and accept that climate change is real. Now, whether or not that number is accurate and climate change is real or not, that is all a separate discussion. The important thing to note is they rely on the concept of consensus to establish authority behind their argument. So I usually ask them directly, do you believe in scientific consensus? And when they say yes, I point out that there is a strong scientific consensus, often cited as around 95 to 98% in certain surveys of biologists, that life begins at conception. And what does that mean? It means that at conception, you have a unique human organism with its own DNA. It is biologically distinct. It is, by definition, a new human life. And once you accept that premise, the implication becomes unavoidable. If life begins at conception, then abortion after that is a termination of a unique human life. And that's not a rhetorical claim. That's a purely biological one. And that's why I think the distinction she tried to draw is so important, because it wasn't just a slip. It was a moment where the underlying logic of the left was exposed. And that logic only works if you accept two things at the same time. First, that ending a baby's life is justified under what's often framed euphemistically as a woman's choice, which is really just a manner to remove the consequences of a procreative act. And second, that the existence of children, those who are actually allowed to be born, can then be used as the reason to take away our God-given right to defend ourselves. So what you end up with is a double standard that creates a double loss. On one side, you have the loss of human life through abortion. On the other, you have the loss of a fundamental right, the right to self-defense for 330 million Americans. And that, folks, is the contradiction. You can't say you're defending life while selectively deciding which life counts, and at the same time using that argument to strip away the right to self-defense from everyone else. And at that point, folks, it's not about protecting life at all for the left. It's obvious that it's about applying principles only when they're convenient to their political cause. Anyway, folks, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. Hope you have a terrific day. Peace.